Good afternoon and welcome. This webinar is a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, VA Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, CFBNP, and the Veterans Health Administration Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Education and Training Office. My name is True Lester Pauling. I am the Senior Outreach Specialist in CFBNP. I will be your moderator this afternoon. Everyone's phone has been muted. If you have a question during the presentation today, please type it in the Q&A box on the right of the screen. I will read the questions at the end of the presentation, and the presenter will provide a response. This presentation is not available after this webinar, but a handout is available for all the resources Mrs. Mells will speak about today. This is a live recording. I would like to thank Ms. Lillie Mells for this collaboration. We are grateful for your time today. But before we get started, I would like to introduce Mr. Conrad Washington, Director of the VA Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Mr. Washington is a retired combat Marine with 20 years of active duty service. He is a licensed minister, actively serving in his faith. He received his Master's of Divinity in Pastoral Studies from Moody Theological Seminary, Master's in Business Management, and a Bachelor's of Science degree in Education. Additionally, he is a graduate of VA's class of 2017 Virtual Aspiring Leaders Program. At this time, I give you Mr. Conrad Washington for today's opening remarks.
Thank you, True. I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. As I always say, you could be many places, but you chose to hang out with us today, and we appreciate that. We're excited once again to bring to you our monthly S.A.V.E training by none other than our own Lillie Mells. So we appreciate you. I want to share a few things with you. This month, we're hosting the VA is what's called PACT Act Summer Vet Fest. That means that the new act that was signed by the president last year, there are many events happening in July that can bring you closer to information and knowledge about the PACT Act. You can just go to Google and type in PACT Act events in July, and you're able to get information to find out where those events are. I'm excited to have Lillie Mells today. She's a program manager from the Education and Training Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, and she's going to share with you some very important information regarding suicide prevention training. I also will share with you that one topic that is on the rise is anti-Semitism across this nation. It's growing, it's threatening the safety and security of many Jewish people. This hate has surfaced so much that President Biden established a working group to counter anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination and bias. This hate is being exposed by extremist groups and individuals from online and in person. And as you already know, we must be able to bring people together from all backgrounds, all faith, all ethnicities, in order to serve our veterans, their families, and caregivers, and beneficiaries. And we're doing that by hosting things like this today. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you get a lot out of this training today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. At this time, I would like to introduce Ms. Lillie Mells, who will be providing today's presentation. Please read a summary of her bio to the left of the screen. Ms. Mells is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years of experience. She has worked in various capacities to include child abuse, domestic violence, and substance abuse. Lillie is an Air Force veteran and has served as Director of Psychological Health for the Virginia Air National Guard. Lillie has been with the Department of Veteran Affairs since 2013, working in suicide prevention. Currently, she is the Education and Training Program Coordinator at the Office of Mental Health Suicide Prevention at Veteran Affairs Central Office. At this time, I give you Ms. Lillie Mells for today's presentation. Lillie?
Thank you, Ms. Pauling, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Washington, for partnering with the Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. I'm excited to be here, so I want to go ahead and get started as quickly as I can. I'm going to shut down my video so that we won't have any bandwidth issues, and then I'll turn it back on for Q&A. So first, let me start off by asking a question for you all. I want you all to drop your information in the chat box, but I will say this: suicide prevention can be a tough subject. But if you're having any issues, you can always step out of the presentation and come back in. There's not going to be any gory details that we will go over. So first of all, I would like to know who's on the line. If you can drop in the chat box, do we have any Army representatives? Anybody former Army members or current Army members? Please drop in the chat if you're Army. How about Navy? Any Marines? How about my brothers and sisters in blue, in the Air Force? All right. Any Coast Guard? What about the Guard and Reserve? Awesome, awesome. So I see a lot of Army folks. I'm outnumbered here. But one of the things I like to say about those who have served, I always like to give homage to everyone in the service, because each branch of the service has a different mission and you bring something different to the table. I deployed alongside each branch of the military service, and I appreciate everyone because of what they brought to the table. And you just have a deeper appreciation, especially when you know what each service brings to the table. So I just wanted to acknowledge all of you for that. Okay, so as I said earlier, suicide prevention can be a tough topic. So if you need to step out, you can do so. Remember that we have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 988. It's the same number as the Veterans Crisis Line, which got enacted in July of 2022. So instead of the 10-digit number, it's now 988. And just press number 1 if you're a veteran. If you're not, just hold the line and a civilian responder will respond with you. So this is what we're going to cover today: facts about veteran suicide, common myths and realities about suicide, and then I'm going to go over the steps of VA S.A.V.E. This is our gatekeeper training, our suicide prevention one-on-one training, and then we're going to talk about our resources. So by participating in this training, you'll have a good understanding of the scope of veteran suicide within the U.S., how to identify someone who may be at risk for suicide, and know what to do when you do identify someone at risk for suicide. So I want you to take a moment and think about this. What is your biggest questions around suicide and talking to people in crisis? What is your biggest question about suicide and talking to people in crisis? I want you to think about that. And then hopefully by the time we get through this presentation, I would have answered that question for you. So let's go over our facts about veteran suicide. So it's a public health problem. As far as the VA is concerned, it's the #1 public health problem for veterans. The rates of suicide is rising, not only among veterans, but also among the general population. And for every death by suicide, there's at least 135 individuals that are impacted. And I would venture to say that there may be even more than that, depending on how active that person is in their community, their neighborhood, any civic organizations, churches, those kinds of things. So you can easily get to 135 people. Suicide is a complex issue. There's no single cause. If we knew of a single cause, we could probably combat this problem sooner, but it's often the result of complex interaction of risk and protective factors at the individual, community, and societal level. Now, risk factors, these are those challenges, those obstacles that are associated with increased likelihood of suicidal behaviors. Protective factors can help offset those risk factors. These are buffers, these are tools, these are skills that you can use. So one of the things that we want to do to prevent suicide is that we have to maximize the protective factors and minimize the risk factors. So get rid of those obstacles and create more tools and skills that people can use. So let's go over some of our risk factors and protective factors. So this is not an all-inclusive list that we have here, but this is some of more of the prominent ones that we have seen. But believe me, we can add a dozen or more things to this list, but we're just going to go over the few that we have here right now. So risk factors. So prior suicide attempt. Doesn't mean that everyone who has had a suicide attempt will go on to have another attempt, but it does mean that they're at a greater risk than someone who has not engaged in that behavior. So it is a risk factor. Mental health issues. So when we talk about mental health issues, we're talking about untreated mental health issues. So when you have untreated mental health issues, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, this definitely puts you at a greater risk for suicide versus someone who's being treated for those issues. Next, substance abuse. So when we talk about substance abuse, we're talking about things that are going to alter your mood and your judgment. Anytime you use mood altering substances, it definitely alters your judgment and it definitely puts you at a greater risk for suicide. Next, access to lethal means. When we talk about lethal means, we could be talking about weapons. We also could be talking about stockpiling of medication, overdose. But really what we have seen, especially with our veterans, is that weapons, firearms are the number one issue. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But when you have access to lethal means, along with some of the challenges that people are facing, it definitely puts you at a greater risk for suicide. Next, recent loss. So when we talk about loss, this could be loss of a family member, loss of a friend, loss of a job. Loss definitely increases your risk for suicide. Next, legal or financial challenges, especially legal challenges when you're facing possible jail time. It definitely puts a person at risk. And financial challenges, bankruptcy, those kind of things, they definitely put you at a greater risk for suicide. Next on the list is relationship issues. So when we talk about relationship issues, we're talking about failed relationships. And you would be surprised to know that relationships is very high up there on the list. When you have a failed relationship, more than not, it's almost as if you're going through the grieving process of a death. You go through some of the same emotions: shock, shame, guilt, denial, anger, all of that. And so when you see that in relationships that fail, it definitely puts that person at a greater risk for suicide. Next, unemployment. So when you're unemployed and you're unable to care for yourself, your family members, it definitely leads to homelessness, housing issues. All of those are definitely connected, and it puts the individual at greater risk for suicide. Now let's move on to the other side when we talk about protective factors. And remember what I said earlier, protective factors are those skills, those tools, those buffers. These are the things that you can do when you're in challenging situations. So access to mental health care. So if you're having mental health issues and you have access to care and you engage in treatment, it definitely puts you at a better position than someone who's not receiving those kinds of treatment. Next, sense of connectiveness. So when we talk about connectiveness, think about those who have served in the military. When you're behind those gates, you're assigned to a unit. You know what that unit's job is. You know what the mission is. You know the mission of your service. And so when you have that kind of connectiveness, you know exactly why you're there and what you're doing. And sometimes when folks leave the military, whether they retire or separate, you don't have that sense of connectedness. But it's definitely a protective factor. It's definitely a protective factor. Next, problem-solving skills. We joke about this in the office because a few of my buddies are from New York, like myself. And one of the things that I share with them is that in New York, when I was growing up, we didn't have problem-solving skills. There was only one way we knew how to solve a problem. And so if anybody knows that way, just put it in the chat box. How do you think we solve problems? When I was growing up back in the 80s. Any ideas? And so what I would say is that we used our fists, instead of actually using skills, we used our fists and we fought. And I will tell you, that's not a good way to solve problems. And if we learn problem solving skills very early on, it can help us in later in life deal with challenges and stressful situations. And so it's a good skill to have. And it's definitely a protective factor. Next on the list, sense of spirituality. Now, this is very individualized. Some people will practice formal religion. Some people will actually meditate. Some people will read the Bible. Some people will pray. Some people will actually go into a house of worship. So it depends on what works for that individual. It may not work for everybody, but it is a protective factor for many. Next, mission or purpose. It almost goes back to that connectiveness. When you have a mission and a purpose, you tend to do better. You tend to be more productive. You know why you're here. A lot of people, when they get out of the military, they kind of are at a loss as to what is their mission now? What is their purpose now? And so you really have to find that niche. You really have to find something that's worthwhile, something to engage in that makes you proud of what you're doing, serving your community, serving other veterans. And that's why you'll see a lot of veterans actually working in veteran service organizations or working for the Department of Veterans Affairs. In some way, we want to give back and help other military personnel. Next, physical health. And I will say this and foot stomp this. If you're walking around with ailments, untreated ailments, and in pain, you really need to get help for those because it can be a risk factor when you're walking around in pain all day. So for most people, get those ailments taken care of. Get your annual checkups, get your physicals. And the interesting thing is that when you're serving in the military, a lot of times we tend to overlook any of our medical or mental health issues. We just must forge ahead, keep with the mission. And a lot of us didn't realize that we were so bad off until we got out. We had pains that we never knew existed because we're so used to pushing through it. And so if you can get help for those physical ailments and those mental health issues, is definitely going to put you in a better position than someone who's not getting help for those. Next on the list, employment. So if you're employed, it always puts you in, it's definitely a positive protective factor because that means that you can take care of yourself, you can take care of your family, you can sustain yourself. So just imagine someone who's unemployed, they can't feed their family. Imagine going home and knowing that you cannot feed your children. It's tough. So being employed is definitely a protective factor, a positive protective factor. And then last, social and emotional well-being. You definitely want to engage in activities that's going to increase your social and emotional well-being. Be around people that help support that. Get involved in things that will help support that, agencies, organizations that will help support that. Next, we're going to take a look at some of the key findings from the 2022 National Veteran Suicide Prevention Annual Report. Now, each year, a report comes out and we get some different statistics on what's happening. So what we saw from 2001 to 2020 is that there was a slight dip in suicides, which is great. But I will tell you, if you look at the numbers, 6,796, and the dip went to 6,146. That's not something that I can celebrate. Yes, there was a dip in the numbers, but it's not something that we can celebrate. We need to get those numbers drilled down to zero. So until those numbers are down to zero, single digits, we really can't celebrate that. Next, so this is the veteran suicide rate by age and sex. And so we can see here, 18 to 34 are males, 35 to 54, 55 to 74, and then 75 and older. So we can definitely see the disparity in the numbers, but the highest rate is ages 18 to 34. And so those are the ones that we definitely have to pay attention to. However, if you look at 75 and older, those numbers are starting to grow as well. Okay. Now, remember earlier I talked about lethal means. And so what is lethal means? So lethal means it could be firearms, poisoning, suffocation, or a number of other different things that people use. But when we look at the methods that people are using, firearms, non-veteran adults, 50% have used firearms. When we look at the veterans, 71% have used firearms. And this is the difference between 2020 and 2001. But there has been an increase. Okay, and look at our veteran males in 2020, 72%, 72%, and our veteran females, 48%, which is an increase by 11%. And what it's telling us is that firearms is the number one issue. It's the number one method that veterans, and not only veterans, but people in general are using. Veterans are at a higher rate, but it's the number one method that's being used. Okay? And so it accounted for 72% of male veteran suicides in 2020 and 48% of female suicides in 2020. And so the VA has really had to boost up its education on lethal means and lethal means safety. When you look at the other forms of lethal means, poisoning, suffocation, and other, they don't even come close to firearms. And when we talk about other, this could be leaping from a height, this could be ramming a vehicle into a fixed object, those sorts of things, but they still don't even come close to the percentages that we're seeing in firearm use. So what is lethal means safety? So in the context of suicide prevention, safe storage of lethal means is any action that builds in time and space between a suicidal impulse and the ability to harm oneself. So I'm going to say that again. It's any action that builds in time and space between a suicidal impulse and the ability to harm oneself. So that's our goal, to build in that time and space between that, when that individual has that thought and when they act on that thought. And so effective lethal means safety education and counseling, it's collaborative, veteran-centered, and it respects the role that firearms and medications play in a veteran's lives. And so what the VA has done is we have beefed up our education on lethal means and lethal means safety. We have educated not only the veteran, the providers, and the family members, because these are the three individuals that really need to know what lethal means safety means and what does it mean to that veteran. And so we have increased the education on that. So most suicidal crises are brief, and the time from decision to action is usually less than 1 hour. And so we see here, these are a couple of studies that were done. And so less than 5 minutes was 24% of attempters. Less than 20 minutes was 48%, and within an hour was 71%. So what we see is that we really have to put in the time and space between the thought and the action. And lethal means safety, it does work. It reduces access to lethal suicide methods. It's one of the few population interventions that has been shown to decrease suicide rates. And about 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt do not necessarily go on to die by suicide. So that's a good thing. And so what we have done is we've collaborated with the veterans ahead of time. We understood that, for an example, in the past, when someone was suicidal and we knew they had a weapon or they disclosed they had a weapon, the first thing that we would do is get on the horn, get the law enforcement to confiscate that weapon, and that veteran or that individual will never get that weapon back. And what we found is that that didn't really work, because then people would not be honest about the weapons that they owned. And so what we had to do is go back and think about it and say, okay, how can we meet this person halfway? How can we help them by not taking away their right to own a weapon? And so what we've done is we rethought it and said, okay, if you're in this crisis, how about we can lock that weapon up in this safe storage, gun lock, cable lock, hand it over to a trusted friend or relative until you can get through this crisis. And what we found is that that seemed to work much better. That seemed to work much better than just completely confiscating the weapon. Now, suicide is preventable. Despite what you may have heard, it is preventable. So now I want to ask you guys some questions about myths and realities about suicide. And so I want you to type in your answer in the box. You're either going to type myth or reality. And so the first question, get ready. People who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. Is that a myth or reality? Type that in the box. Myth or reality? People who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. Okay, I see a couple of myths in there. Anybody else? Okay, so we got a good number of myths in there. So you guys are doing good because it is a myth. No matter how casually or jokingly said, suicide threats should never be ignored, and they may indicate serious suicidal feelings. So someone who talks about suicide provides others an opportunity to intervene before those behaviors occur. So that's the key thing that you want to remember. Even though someone may have a thought, they may not actually have intent to do anything, but it gives you an opportunity to intervene before something actually occurs. Next question. The only one who can really help someone who is suicidal is a mental health counselor or therapist. Is that a myth or reality? The only one who can really help someone who's suicidal is a mental health counselor or therapist. Okay, I see a lot of myths in there. Okay, so you guys are doing good. So special training is not required to safely raise the subject of suicide. So helping someone feel included and showing genuine heartfelt support can also make a big difference during a challenging time. So if you can just show some compassion, validate that person's concern, and be a good listener, you have gone a long way in helping that individual. Okay, now I'm going to go over the steps of S.A.V.E. Okay, and like I said earlier, this is our entry-level suicide prevention training. So VA S.A.V.E, it teaches communities how to help veterans or anyone at risk for suicide. It's going to help you act with care and compassion if you encounter a person who is in a suicidal crisis. So you don't have to write this down, but if you want to, but S, signs of suicidal thinking should be recognized. A, ask the most important question of all. Does anybody know what that question is? Ask the most important question of all. I want you to drop it in the chat box. What's the most important question of all? V, validate that person's experience. E, encourage treatment and expedite getting help. Now, I'm going to hold off on answering your question, what's the most important question of all? We'll get to that as we go through the 6 steps of S.A.V.E. So S, signs of suicidal thinking. So you want to learn how to recognize these signs, these warning signs: hopelessness, feeling like there's no way out of their situation. And we see a lot of that in veterans, especially, as they're transitioning out of the military. Anxiety. Do we know what anxiety is? That feeling of nervousness, something is about to happen, not sure what, not sure when, not sure who. Some people will have physical signs. Some people will have sweaty palms. Some people will feel nauseated. Some people will actually have a full-blown panic attack. Okay? Agitation, sleeplessness, or mood swings, feeling that there's no reason to live. Next, rage or anger. One of the things we know about rage and anger is that generally it's a mask for other issues. When we see rage and anger, usually if we peel back the layers, we will find probably some mental health issues underneath there. Usually some anxiety, usually some depression. Okay? Next, engaging in risky activities without thinking. And we have seen a lot of that, especially lately in our society. Risky activities without thinking. I've seen people on the highway, motorcycles, and in vehicles driving at high rates of speed, weaving in and out of traffic, cutting people off as if they just have no care, increasing alcohol or drug use. And remember earlier what I said, when you engage in when you ingest mood altering substances, it definitely alters your judgment and it definitely puts you at risk for suicide. And some people will have signs of suicidal thinking. Withdrawing from family and friends, that's another warning sign. Now, the presence of the following signs required immediate attention. So thinking about hurting or killing themselves, looking for ways to die. And believe me, there's 1,000,001 things that you can do to the 10th power. Self-destructive or risk-taking behavior, especially when it involves alcohol, drugs, or weapons. And you may or may not have seen a similar scenario where someone is depressed. They feel like, well, maybe if I get intoxicated or high, I don't have to think about all these things that are troubling me. But they're so depressed that the alcohol really doesn't help. And it's a temporary numbness that goes on. And then at some point, they may even become suicidal. And if they have a weapon, it just increases it. It just increases it. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to these warning signs. Okay, now asking the question, know how to ask the most important question of all. So I saw a couple of things in the chat box. Are you thinking of hurting yourself? I saw, are you thinking of killing yourself? Are you thinking of killing yourself? So I saw that one twice and I saw hurting. So here's the answer. Are you thinking about killing yourself? And the reason we ask this question is because we want to make no mistake about the answer that we get. So if I say hurt, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Well, hurt can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. Someone can burn themselves with a cigarette and feel like they're hurting themselves. Okay. Someone could say, well, killing myself and hurting myself is two different things. So we want to be clear. Are you thinking about killing yourself? And giving that person the opportunity to answer as honestly as possible. We don't want to leave any room for confusion. Either you're thinking about killing yourself or you're not. That's what the question that we want to ask. And so when we ask that question, we do want to use a couple of things to help us when we ask that question. So you do want to ask that question if you identify warning signs or symptoms. You definitely want to go ahead and ask that question. You do want to ask the question in a natural way that it flows with the conversation. So let's say if you're visiting Mr. Jones at the community living center, and he's an elderly man who lives there, and you work there. You might work there, and you say to him, "Oh, how are you doing today, Mr. Jones?" And Mr. Jones says, "Well, I'm not doing so great, but when you leave, it's going to be over." And so you want to ask Mrs. Jones, what do you mean by that? What do you mean that when I leave, it's going to be over? You want to definitely probe and find out what Mr. Jones is talking about. You want to go ahead and ask that question if the signs are there. Are you thinking about killing yourself, Mr. Jones? You want to be able to go ahead and ask that question. But you do want to make sure that it flows naturally with the conversation. So let's say Mr. Jones again, and you come up to him, how you doing today, Mr. Jones? And he says, well, I'm doing okay. The grandkids are supposed to visit this weekend. And you say, oh, your grandkids are visiting this weekend? He said, yeah, I got 4 of them. 3 of them are supposed to visit. And then you say, are you going to kill yourself, Mr. Jones? Now, if you ask Mr. Jones that in this way, he's going to feel like you're putting words in his mouth because he's talking about grandkids visiting. Had nothing to do with him wanting to kill himself. So we have to make sure that it's asked in the right way and that it flows with the conversation. Now, there are some things that you don't want to do when you ask that question. You don't want to ask the question as if you're looking for a no answer. So if you're looking for a no answer, all you have to do is put no in the question. So how do you do that? You say, Mr. Jones, you're not going to kill yourself, are you? Well, if you say, Mr. Jones, you're not going to kill yourself, you've already answered the question for him. There's no way for him to answer it honestly because you've already answered it for him. Another example of that would be, let's say my daughter, she has these shoes, Crocs. I know my team has heard this before, but these shoes, Crocs, C-R-O-C-S. I don't like those shoes. I don't think they're made for walking. I think they're made for the beach. That's just my personal opinion. However, my daughter, any opportunity she gets, she wants to put those shoes on. She wants to wear them in school. She just wants to wear them everywhere. And so if I don't want her to wear those shoes, this is what I say to her. Nicole, you're not wearing those shoes, are you? And her answer is, no, ma'am, because I basically have told her that she's not going to wear those shoes. If I wanted her to select which shoes she wanted to wear, then I would say to her, Nicole, what shoes are you wearing today? And then she could freely pick whichever shoes she wanted. But if I say you're not, that's not a question. That's already an answer within the question. So you want to make sure you're not looking for a no answer when you ask the question, are you thinking of killing yourself? And don't wait to ask the question when someone is halfway out the door. We want to make sure that you give yourself enough time to assist that person and let them talk about what's going on. Next, V, validate the person's experience. I cannot emphasize how important it is to validate someone. When you validate someone, you're letting them know that they matter, their opinion matters, and that they're someone, that they're not being dismissed. So you want to be able to talk openly about suicide with that individual. Be willing to listen and allow them to express their feelings. Recognize that the situation is serious, but do not pass judgment. One of the things about human nature is that we can easily pick up when someone is judging us. And once you find that out, it's a big turnoff and that person will shut down. So don't pass judgment. Reassure them that help is available and then get them the resources as needed. But as I said, if you validate someone, you have gone a long way. It's huge when you validate someone. You just make them feel like they matter and their opinion matters. E, encourage treatment and expedite getting help. So what should you do if you think someone is suicidal? You don't want to keep it a secret. This is not the type of behavior that we want to keep a secret, okay? Don't leave that person alone. Don't think just because, oh, they're in a room and there's nothing in there. There's many things that can be used in a room. And even when you think the room is empty, believe me, there's many things that you can use, okay? Try to get that person to seek immediate help from his own doctor or the nearest emergency room. Call 911 if necessary. Reassure them that help is available. And after you call 911, you can go ahead and call the Veterans Crisis Line. And remember, now you can dial 988 instead of dialing the 10-digit number. Okay? And when you call the crisis line, even after you've called 911, they're going to reach out and still follow up with that veteran, regardless of the disposition. They're going to follow up. Now, what do you do when you're talking with a veteran at risk for suicide? You want to remain calm. That's the first thing that you want to do. You want to remain calm. You want to listen more than you speak. Remember, you're validating that person. You're giving them an opportunity to tell you what's going on with them. You're giving them an opportunity to vent. You want to maintain good eye contact. You want to act with confidence. Don't argue with that individual. So stay away from all those controversial topics. That might be everything that's going on right now. Religion, COVID, healthcare, abortion. It's so many topics out there, but you want to stay away from those things because really you're fighting a losing battle. Everybody has their heels dug in, nobody's budging, so you don't want to go there in those conversations. Okay? Use open body language. You don't want to be like Macaulay Culkin on Home Alone with the shocked face. You want to be open and inviting. Limit your questions. Let that individual do the talking. Many times people who are in crisis, they know that there's nothing singularly that you can do to change their situation. However, by just allowing them to vent and being a good listener, you've gone a long way in helping. Because for many people, they don't get the opportunity to really speak. Think about it. When you were a child, I remember the first time I was told, children should be seen and not heard. That's the first time really you're being told to shut up, essentially. And so think about it as you go into adulthood. Children should be seen and not heard. Think about folks who join the military, okay? Especially if you enlisted and you go into boot camp. Basically, you're told to shut up and just march. Do what you're told to do. So for a long time, people are being told, be quiet, be quiet. And many times they just want to be able to share, vent a little bit about what's going on with them. So give them that opportunity to do that. Use supportive and encouraging comments, but be honest that there's no quick solution. But help is available. We've had people call the VA and say, they're going to kill themselves because they're 8 months behind on their mortgage. The VA doesn't have that kind of petty cash to just write a check for their mortgage. But there are resources available. There are other resources that are available, and that's what you want to be able to express to them. But there's no quick solutions. Even if you're suffering with mental health issues, most issues are not going to be cured overnight. You have to go into treatment. Even if you're on medication, it doesn't work right away. Everything usually takes a little bit of time. So there's no quick solutions. Next, what do you do if a veteran expresses suicidal ideation during a phone call? You want to keep the caller on the line. Don't hang up or transfer that call. And I will tell you, when I was working in the office full time, I was never good at transferring calls. Never, because I only get about 2 or 3 transfers each year. And so by the time I would figure it out, I'd be done disconnected the person. So you want to make sure that you do not hang up or transfer that call. You want to remain calm. Try to get as much identifying information on the caller as possible, their name, their phone number, and their current location. If you know how to do this, conference call to the Veterans Crisis Line, but don't hang up until the responder has taken the call. Now, our call center operators, they're very good at doing this. They know how to transfer these calls. They know how to hold on. And so usually I leave that up to someone at the call center. Enlist co-workers for assistance. Use your messaging services on Teams. You may even have to use your cell phone. If you're alone and on the phone, you have to get some assistance. We're fortunate. We have government phones and we have our personal phone. So you may have to use your personal phone if you're on the other line. If the caller disconnects, you want to call them back immediately. If no answer, then you want to go ahead and dial 911, let them know that you were speaking to someone and the call got disconnected and you would like them to do a welfare check. Okay? And then you can go ahead and call the Veterans Crisis Line and have them follow up with that individual as well, because they will reach out. And so that was our steps to SAVE. So you want to remember, signs of suicidal thinking should be recognized. Ask the most important question of all, and that question is, are you thinking of killing yourself? Validate that individual's experience, because you want to make sure that you allow them to be heard and allow them to know that their voice does matter. And then you want to encourage treatment and expedite getting help. So those are the steps to SAVE that we want to make sure that we follow. Okay. Okay, I think we already had this one. So I'm going to now we're going to go over some resources, and then I'm going to leave a couple of minutes for some questions. Okay, so this is our crisis line. As I mentioned earlier, it changed from the 10-digit number to 988 back in July of 2022. However, I will say this, that the 10-digit number will still be in effect probably for another couple of years until all of the carriers are online. So if someone happens to dial the old number, they will still get through the crisis line. Anyone can call the crisis line, veterans, active duty service members, family members, friends, or you can even call anonymously. The crisis line opened up in 2007 and it's been going strong since. We've had over 6 million phone calls, over 800,000 chats, over almost 300,000 texts, and over 1 million referrals, and over 269,000 dispatches of emergency services. And so the crisis line works directly with our suicide prevention coordinators. The suicide prevention coordinators are at every VA medical facility. And when someone calls the crisis line, a referral is also sent to the VA suicide prevention coordinator located closest to where that individual lives. So the calls go into a call center and then they farm them out to the local areas. And then we have our Veterans Crisis Line resource locator. So if you go on this webpage, you can put in the zip code and you can find a suicide prevention coordinator in the local area. And they do a lot of outreach. They do follow up with veterans in crisis. They make sure they take care of all the referrals from the crisis line, and they do training in the community. Making the connection. So this is a list of video vignettes on the website where you have real veterans talking about their experiences with mental health and suicidality and how they got help from the VA and how it has changed their lives. So you can take a look at that. Next, practice safe storage of firearms, medication, and other lethal means. So keepingitsecure.net. And so this is going to give you tips on how to secure firearms unloaded and locked and secured. New lethal means safety resources. So as I mentioned earlier, we have educated not only the veterans, the providers, and the family members. And so these are some of the brochures about lethal means safety for the household, veterans, and their families. This is some of our mental health apps that we have. They're all free. We just ask that people use them in conjunction with their therapists. We say that an app alone is not going to be sufficient for all treatment. It's just to help enhance your treatment, but they're all free and you can go on, download them. And then we also have a safety plan and a PTSD coach. And basically you can have a safety plan on your phone. You work out the safety plan with your provider, and a safety plan is a written list of coping mechanisms that you can use when you're in a crisis. And so to have that on your phone is just wonderful, because if you get in a crisis, you can just pull it up versus having to go to a paper sheet. Next, coaching in the care. This is a program through the VA where family members can get help in getting a veteran into care. We have a lot of people who feel like they don't need help, they don't want help. And so this service helps family members coach veterans into care, and they can even speak to the veteran themselves. And then we have information for LGBTQ. And so this is very new, but we want to make sure that we reach all populations. Postvention resources. We don't talk about postvention a lot, but we can't ignore it, that we do have things that happen in our society. And so we have to educate the communities, the providers, and the workplace. And so we do have postvention resources for our professionals. And in our VA SAVE training, we partner with PsychArmor Institute. And so this training is also online, among other trainings. They're all free. All you have to do is go to psycharmor.org and register, and you can take any of their trainings that are online. This one is 25 minutes and it's offered. And we just ask that communities and anybody who can help with suicide prevention go ahead and take this training. And I think that's all that I have, and I'm going to turn it back over to our host. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mells, for that very helpful and very informative presentation. We don't have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, but we do have one from Mr. Ed Martin. And he asked the question, what should you say to the call center staff, or should the person in crisis make the call?
Either one can make the call. If you call the Veterans Crisis Line or just the crisis line, let me say this, the Veterans Crisis Line is the same number as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The only difference is that if you press 1, you're going to get a veteran responder. But anybody who calls, you can call on behalf of the individual if they can't speak themselves, and you can let them know what's going on, and they will reach out to that individual as well. And once they reach out, they will also send a referral to, if they're a veteran, they will send it to the VA that's closest to that individual's home. And then that suicide prevention coordinator has 24 hours to reach out. Them and their team have 24 hours to reach out to that individual.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mells. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box, but I wanted to let the audience know if we are unable to get around, or you have additional questions that you would like to ask Ms. Mells, please send them directly to her or send them to us and we'll get them to her and she'll get a response back to you right away. We do have your email addresses, and if you need to reach out to her, please see her point of contact information on the screen here. And you can also reach out to our team for any information. Our point of contact information is on the screen as well. At this time, I'm going to turn the mic back over to Mr. Washington, who will provide some closing remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Pauling. Appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. Ms. Lillie Mells, we thank you so much, ma'am. Once again, you had a great brief and very informative. I want to invite our attendees to join us next week, as we also will host a LGBTQ plus health program and veteran care webinar. That's next Tuesday, July 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So until then, you all be blessed and take care of yourselves.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
If you registered for this event, we will provide you with today's handouts and resources. A recording of this webinar will be provided on our website at a later date. Please subscribe to our website and Facebook on future webinars and information. This adjourns today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Have a safe and great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.